They didn't see a soldier. They didn't see the medals pinned to his chest or the sacrifice etched into his bones. They only saw a uniform on black skin, and in their world, that was enough to say no. Elijah Brooks wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't carrying anger. He wasn't carrying pride. He was carrying something far heavier, the body of a brother who didn't make it home. At Grandview International Airport, the rules shifted. Protocols bent. Excuses piled up faster than answers. One moment, it was a security concern. The next, it was policy. And in a flash, the man they should have honored became the man they feared. They thought they could dismiss him quietly. Another black face behind another unfortunate incident. But what they didn't know was that behind that steady silence was a story built stronger than their prejudice. Because sometimes the loudest battle cries aren't screams. They're the footsteps of a man refusing to step aside. They're the hands that carry a casket no apology could lift. They're the eyes that say without speaking, "You will not erase me." This isn't just a story about an airport mistake. This isn't about paperwork or policies. This is about what happens when dignity refuses to be denied. And today, the whole world was about to watch. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The airport never sleeps. It hums like a living thing, restless and relentless. Families with overstuffed suitcases, businessmen barking into Bluetooth headsets, children dragging backpacks twice their size. Among the chaos, no one noticed the soldier. Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks stepped through the glass doors of Grandview International Airport, boots clicking steady against the polished floor. His uniform was immaculate pressed and perfect, his chest heavy with ribbons and bars earned through years of sacrifice. But the heaviest thing he carried wasn't pinned to his jacket. It was the weight of a wooden casket waiting on the tarmac, covered in the American flag, bearing the name of Private Noah Carter, 19 years old. Gone in a blink, a boy Elijah had promised to bring home. No matter what, he adjusted the folder in his hand, military orders, escort documentation, all in perfect order. Another mission, another brother in arms who didn't get to finish the journey. Airports had a way of making everything impersonal. Numbers, flight times, seat assignments. There was no line for grief here, no express lane for dignity, only metal detectors, boarding passes, and tired sighs. Elijah moved forward, past couples rushing for last calls, past tourists snapping photos of nothing. He wasn't looking for attention. He never did. But some eyes found him anyway. A black man in full uniform, a contradiction in the minds of too many, a target dressed in patriotism they couldn't quite trust. Still, Elijah held his head high, not for himself, but for Noah. No one gets left behind, not on the battlefield, not on American soil, not while he still had breath left in his body. The airline counter stretched out in front of him like a wall, screens blinking destinations he wasn't going to. Voices crackling over intercoms he wasn't meant to hear. He joined the line, waited his turn, boots planted firm, spine straight, hands steady. A woman a few places ahead of him juggled $2 and a purse that seemed determined to self-destruct. A businessman 2 spots back muttered about missed meetings and late flights. No one looked at Elijah twice now. When he finally reached the front, the agent barely glanced up. Her name tag read Claire Whitmore. She was young, maybe 25, eyes tired, smile mechanical, ID and ticket please, she said without inflection. Elijah slid the documents across the counter. Official military orders, escort credentials, identification sharp enough to cut glass. Claire scanned the barcode fingers, tapping with rehearsed speed. For a moment, everything seemed routine. Then her brow furrowed. A hesitation. A pause, just half a second too long. Elijah saw it, felt it. The shift, Claire said, eyes darting to the screen, then back to him. "One moment, sir." She leaned to whisper to the agent beside her, a lanky man with thick glasses, and the permanent scowl of someone underpaid and overstressed. They exchanged a look, not fear, not respect, suspicion. Claire returned her smile, tighter now, forced, fragile. "I'm sorry, sir," she began carefully, "but it appears there's a security flag on your reservation." Elijah kept his voice calm, measured, controlled. "I'm on a military assignment," he said, tapping the folder once lightly. "I have orders to escort a soldier's remains." Claire nodded quickly. "I understand, sir." But another glance over her shoulder, another silent conversation, more invisible walls rising. But what Elijah asked, his tone cool even. She swallowed. "We're unable to allow you to board at this time. There's a protocol." Protocol? That word again, big enough to hide behind, small enough to dodge accountability. Elijah shifted slightly, his boots firm against the floor. "What protocol specifically prevents a military escort from boarding?" Claire's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her keyboard. She opened her mouth, closed it. Looked back at her supervisor, a man in a stiff gray suit with the brittle expression of someone who had long forgotten what honor looked like. The supervisor approached slowly. "Deliberate, careful, sir," he said, voice dipped in fake regret. "We apologize for the inconvenience. It's simply that we have new security protocols for special transports. Special transports, like the casket waiting outside, like Noah Carter's final flight home." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Show me the policy." The supervisor's lips thinned into a line. He didn't expect a challenge. He didn't want a scene. Behind Elijah, the line grew restless. People shifting, whispering, noticing. A soldier in full dress, blues being denied at the gate. Not something you see every day. Phones rose like silent witnesses. The first flash of a camera. The first video recording a story they hadn't even realized they were part of. Yet Elijah stood still, steel inside his skin. He wasn't leaving without Noah Carter, and he sure as hell wasn't leaving quietly. The line behind Elijah stretched longer now, a slow ripple of unrest moving through the travelers. People leaned sideways, pretending not to stare. But the story unfolding was too strange to ignore. A soldier, a casket waiting outside. And still, somehow, this man was being told he didn't belong. The supervisor cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced toward the security desk across the terminal. A silent call for backup. "We're trying to sort this out as quickly as possible, sir," he said, hands raising in the universal language of corporate apology. "But I need you to step aside and wait until we can confirm clearance." Elijah stayed planted. He could feel the heat building in the room, the unspoken tension vibrating against the cold tile floor. "I have nothing to wait for," he said, voice low but sharp. "My orders are clear. My documentation is valid. I have a soldier to bring home." The supervisor's smile faltered, the polished facade slipping at the edges. He was used to customers who argued, who shouted, who made a scene. He wasn't ready for someone who stood like a mountain, silent, steady, and unmovable. "I understand that, sir," he said a little too quickly, "but if you don't comply with our security procedures, I will have to involve airport security." There it was. The threat soft enough to deny later, but sharp enough to cut. Behind Elijah, murmurs grew louder. Someone pulled out a phone recording openly now. Another voice somewhere deeper in the line muttered, "That's messed up." The supervisor noticed too. His eyes flicked nervously across the crowd. The optics were getting worse by the second. And once a story like this caught fire, no PR team in the world could put it out. Still, Elijah didn't move, didn't blink, because he knew exactly what was happening, and he wasn't about to be bullied into silence. Across the terminal, two uniformed airport security officers appeared, moving briskly toward the counter. One of them, Officer Harmon, wore the kind of expression Elijah had seen too many times before. That look of being ready for trouble before trouble even arrived. Claire Whitmore took a step back instinctively. The supervisor straightened his blazer like armor, and Elijah, he simply squared his shoulders, refusing to shrink an inch. Sir Officer Harmon said, as he approached, one hand resting on his belt, "We need you to step aside immediately while we sort out this situation." Elijah turned his gaze on him, calm and cutting. "On what grounds?" The officer hesitated, caught between procedure and pride. No real reason, just a vague security concern passed down the line. "It's for everyone's safety," Harmon said almost apologetically. Standard script, memorized words, meaningless shields. "Everyone's safety," Elijah repeated voice. "Even I'm a decorated soldier escorting a fallen comrade. What about his safety? What about his dignity?" A silence spread wider than any gunfire Elijah had ever faced. Someone in the crowd spoke up then, a deep, worn voice heavy with authority. "This is wrong," the man said. Everyone turned to look. An older gentleman wearing a battered leather jacket and a USMC cap stepped forward from the line. Gray hair, a limp that told its own story. Eyes sharp as razors honed in war zones long forgotten by younger generations. "You're stopping him," the Marine veteran barked, pointing a gnarled finger at Elijah. "For doing his damn duty." The security officers froze. The supervisor swallowed hard. The Marine wasn't alone. Other murmurs of support stirred among the travelers. A woman with a stroller, a businessman in a rumpled suit, a teenager clutching a duffel bag. The tide was turning, and Elijah hadn't raised his voice once. The supervisor stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control. "Sir, please, we're doing our best to ensure compliance with regulations." "Name the regulation," Elijah interrupted. "Simple, direct, no anger. Just the weight of a man who had earned the right to be heard." The supervisor's mouth opened. Closed, nothing came out. Because there was no regulation, there was only fear. And fear had never been a good enough excuse for Elijah Brooks. Behind the counter, Claire looked down at her shoes, shame rising in her cheeks. She hadn't meant for it to go this far, but she hadn't stopped it either. The second security officer, younger, shifted awkwardly. He recognized the wrongness too. The uniform, the folded papers, the unbreakable line of Elijah's shoulders. This wasn't a threat. This was a man fulfilling a sacred promise. The Marine veteran stepped closer, his voice rising so the entire terminal could hear. "You let him board. You let him finish what he started, or every damn person here will know exactly who you really are." Phones were raised higher now, live streams buzzing, truth spreading faster than lies could cover. And for the first time that day, the supervisor's polished confidence cracked, a flicker of real fear in his eyes. Elijah stood silent still, solid as a statue. He didn't need to fight them. He didn't need to scream. He had already won. The weight of silence pressed harder than any noise. In that terminal, with hundreds of eyes locked on him, Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks stood rooted to the floor as if carved from stone. The supervisor, Brett Simmons, shifted uncomfortably. Officer Harmon rubbed the back of his neck. Feeling every second dragged the air heavier. Claire Whitmore fidgeted behind the counter. Her earlier confidence dissolved into nervous glances. And the Marine in the battered jacket wasn't moving either. He just stood there, arms crossed, daring them to make one more wrong move. Simmons opened his mouth, closed it again. He glanced at the cluster of passengers, at the cell phones recording everything, at the veteran glaring at him like a loaded weapon. He knew. They all knew. The narrative had already left their hands. Somewhere in the distance, a loudspeaker blared a final boarding call. Another flight, another destination. But here time had slowed to a crawl. Finally, Simmons leaned toward Claire and muttered something too low to catch. Claire nodded quickly, typing into her computer like her life depended on it. After a moment, she looked up. Her voice shook slightly when she spoke. "Sergeant Brooks," she said, We've re-verified your documentation. You're clear to proceed. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply gathered his papers with a slow, deliberate motion, his every move steeped in quiet power. Claire slid a boarding pass across the counter toward him. Her hand trembled just a little. "Thank you for your service," she whispered. Voice cracking, Elijah looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Not with anger, not with resentment, just a long, steady gaze that forced her to face the shame she hadn't expected to feel when she clocked in that morning. Then he turned and walked. The crowd parted in front of him like water before a ship. No one dared block his path now. The Marine veteran raised his hand in a silent salute. Elijah returned it with a small nod, the kind of gesture soldiers traded across deserts and oceans, where words were too fragile to carry the weight they needed. He moved steadily toward the gate, toward the tarmac, toward Noah Carter's final journey home. And behind him the whispers turned into something else, not scorn, not mockery. Respect belated, but real. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was there. And sometimes the smallest shift can change the whole course of a day or a life. Outside on the tarmac, the sun had begun its slow descent. The sky blushed orange and purple, a flag folding itself into the horizon. The cargo bay doors were open, the casket draped in the stars, and stripes waited in the quiet golden light. Two ramp workers stood at attention nearby, their hats held against their chests, their eyes downcast. A flight attendant wiped at her face discreetly. Pretending it was the wind, Elijah approached with steady steps. Each footfall measured, each breath a prayer. He placed his hand flat against the casket, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold wood, feeling the life it once held. "I kept my word, kid," he whispered under his breath. "You're not alone." A moment passed, just him and the flag in the fading sun, and then he gave the signal. The ground crew moved, lifting the casket with solemn precision, guiding it into the plane's belly where it would ride home, surrounded by metal air and unspoken reverence. Back inside, a small cluster of travelers stood near the windows watching. They didn't speak, didn't film. Some placed hands over hearts. Some simply stood still, letting silence say everything words couldn't. At the counter, Claire Whitmore wiped her eyes. She didn't know the name of the boy in the box, but now she knew she would never forget the man who refused to leave him behind. Officer Harmon watched, his jaw clenched, something bitter twisting in his chest. Not guilt exactly, not regret, something older, something he didn't have a name for yet. Maybe it was shame, maybe it was respect, maybe it was both. As Elijah boarded the plane, he didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he had already said everything that needed saying, not with words, not with fists, not with outrage, with presence, with dignity, with silence louder than any shout. He walked down the aisle past rows of staring passengers. Some nodded, some averted their eyes. It didn't matter. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Noah and for every soldier who never got to walk through a door again. Elijah found his seat near the front, setting his orders gently on his lap. As the engines roared to life and the wheels began their slow roll toward the sky, Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks sat tall, unshaken, unbowed, unbreakable. A ghost in the crowd, no more. A story no one could ever silence. The world moved on, flights departed, announcements echoed, children tugged at parents' sleeves, asking for snacks and souvenirs. But for Elijah Brooks, something had shifted. The battle he hadn't wanted had already begun. He just didn't know yet how far it would reach. The plane cruised through the cloud cover, a smooth, muted roar vibrating through the floor under Elijah's boots. He sat rigid in seat 3A, shoulders, squared arms resting loosely on his thighs. Across the aisle, two businessmen in matching sport coats whispered to each other, glancing his way when they thought he wouldn't notice. A row back, a teenage boy wearing earbuds kept sneaking pictures with his phone. Elijah didn't react, didn't blink. He had lived too many years under too many eyes to be rattled by the weight of being watched. The flag-draped casket of Private Noah Carter rested in the cargo hold below. That was all that mattered, or it should have been. An hour into the flight, a commotion stirred near the back. Raised voices, a few passengers standing in the aisle, tension sharpening the recycled cabin air. Elijah shifted slightly, his instincts flaring, the kind that never fully left a soldier, even long after the gunfire stopped. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her smile brittle, her steps brisk. Seconds later, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor issue in the cabin. Please remain seated and buckled. Thank you. Minor issue." The words meant nothing. The tone meant everything. Something was brewing. It started small. Ripple, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. And Elijah was always paying attention. It began with the flight attendant, Claire, her name tag revealed, circling back to his row 3 times in less than 10 minutes, smiling too wide, pretending to fix the overhead bins, pretending to check the window shades. Passengers around him noticed too. How she hovered, how she whispered to another attendant, casting glances that grew less subtle each time. A woman 2 rows up narrowed her eyes, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. A middle-aged man in the exit row pretended to sleep, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him, and Elijah, silent as ever, sat still. The first strike wasn't a punch, wasn't a shove. It was suspicion, thin, sharp, designed to slice slow. Claire reappeared beside him, feigning casualness. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice sugary, sweet, but tight at the edges. "Would you mind showing me your boarding pass again?" Elijah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved the pass, and handed it to her. Claire's fingers trembled slightly as she scanned it. Then she smiled too quickly, too fake. "Thank you, sir. Just a routine check." "Routine." Elijah said nothing. He took the pass back, sliding it into his pocket without breaking eye contact. Claire lingered a moment longer, then scurried away. But the seed had been planted. The whisper had started around him. The atmosphere changed, not openly hostile, not yet, but cautious. Nervous edges sharpening around him like knives hidden in sleeves. Another 15 minutes passed. Another unnecessary glance. Another pointed whisper. Then came the second approach. This time it wasn't a flight attendant. It was a man in a navy polo and khakis, a fellow passenger, tall, red-faced, reeking of entitlement. He stopped next to Elijah's seat, arms folded, blocking the aisle with his broad frame. "Hey," the man said, voice just loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "Mind telling us why you're here dressed up like that?" Elijah turned his head, slowly meeting the man's eyes with a calm, unreadable stare. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier home," he said evenly. "Military protocol," the man smirked. "Yeah, and where's your badge? Where's your escort credentials? Anyone can rent a uniform, buddy." The word buddy dripped with venom. Around them, silence thickened. A few gasps, some eyes widened in shock. Others nodded, barely perceptible validation. "Permission, the poison spreading." Elijah didn't rise to the bait, didn't raise his voice, didn't let his hands twitch. He simply leaned back slightly, his voice low enough that only the nearest few could hear. "You don't need to know my credentials. You just need to sit down before you embarrass yourself even more." It was said without anger, without bravado. Just a fact, undeniable, unassailable. The man flushed deeper, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. For a second, it looked like he might lash out. But something in Elijah's eyes, something old, something forged under fire, stopped him. The man muttered something under his breath and slunk back to his seat, seething. But the damage was already done. The first shot had been fired, and the war Elijah didn't ask for. had just officially begun. The first strike never looks like a battle, it's quiet. Sharp, cowardly, Elijah Brooks sat motionless as the man retreated, anger buzzing in the narrow aisle like a trapped hornet. Passengers pretended to scroll on phones, pretend read magazines, pretend doze. But the tension in the cabin was real, crackling like static in the recycled air. Claire Whitmore reappeared minutes later, clipboard in hand this time. Different prop, same purpose. She leaned down close enough that Elijah caught the faint scent of nerves underneath her, carefully sprayed perfume. "Sir," she said, softer now, almost pleading, "the captain would like to speak with you." Privately, passengers around them stiffened. A few exchanged meaningful glances. Some leaned in eager for the next piece of the unfolding drama. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't reward the theatrics. He simply rose, slowly unfolding his frame with the same silent authority that once held lines together in the middle of battle. Without a word, he followed Claire toward the front of the aircraft. They stopped near the galley where the curtain to first class hung like a cheap barrier between worlds. Captain Morris, a man in his 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a belly struggling against a tight uniform shirt, waited with arms folded. His expression was tight, guarded, calculated. "Sergeant Major Brooks," he said, voice clipped. "We've had a few concerns raised by passengers." Elijah said nothing. He waited. The captain cleared his throat, clearly, uncomfortable under the weight of his own words. "Given the current climate," he said, "and for the comfort and safety of everyone on board, we're going to ask you to relocate to the rear of the plane, near the galley." Not an order, not quite a request. Something in between a polite exile. For a brief moment, the cabin lights seemed too bright. The world too loud. Elijah's jaw tightened once, brief, controlled. The only sign of the fury burning beneath the uniform, he looked the captain square in the eye. Measured, steady. "Is there a security issue with me?" Elijah asked, voice low enough to make the captain lean in. Captain Morris hesitated. The pause was answer enough. "No, sir," he admitted finally, "but we've had passenger complaints. Some folks are uncomfortable." Uncomfortable, a man in uniform, carrying the remains of a fallen brother, and they were uncomfortable. Elijah could have said many things about cowardice, about prejudice wrapped in the pretty paper of policy, about how far a nation could drift from its own values without even noticing. But he didn't. He simply said, "I paid for my seat. I'm escorting a soldier home. I'm not moving." Each word sharp as a blade but steady as stone. The captain flushed. His mouth opened, ready to argue, ready to escalate. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the narrow hallway. "I'm sorry, Captain," a flight attendant said, stepping forward, this one older, darker-skinned, wearing years of quiet survival on her face. "But he has a right to stay in his assigned seat." She said it simply, not loudly, not aggressively, just the truth dropped like an anchor. Claire Whitmore looked as if she wanted to sink into the floor. The captain stared at the attendant for a long moment, calculation warring with pride. Finally, he sighed through his nose, a tiny surrender. "Very well," he muttered. "Return to your seat, Sergeant." Elijah nodded once, a sharp, deliberate motion, and turned back toward his row. As he walked, eyes tracked him again, some wide with curiosity, some narrow with suspicion, some very few lowered in shame. He returned to 3A without a word, sat down, buckled his belt, folded his hands in his lap, and waited. For a while there was peace, or what passed for peace when it was stitched together with tension and fear. The engines hummed, the clouds rolled by. The seconds stretched into long, heavy minutes. But Elijah knew better. The first strike was never the last. 30 minutes later, it came again, this time from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Morris' voice crackled due to unexpected maintenance concerns at our destination airport. We have been instructed to divert to Lakewood Regional Airport. A murmur rolled through the cabin. Passengers shifted, groaned, sighed in frustration. But Elijah sat perfectly still because he knew something most others didn't. Lakewood wasn't the scheduled airport. It wasn't even nearby. It was a tiny regional facility, rarely used, poorly equipped, heavily policed. And it was the kind of place where people like Elijah Brooks were often made to disappear quietly. Just another unfortunate misunderstanding. Just another story no one would bother to record. The first strike isn't meant to win. It's meant to break you just enough to make you stumble, to make you doubt your right to stand. But Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks didn't stumble. He didn't break. He sat taller, straighter. Because some fights are bigger than fists and some uniforms carry more than history. They carry memory, and memory does not move. The plane began its slow descent, not toward the city lights Elijah was expecting, but toward the dark, empty sprawl of a forgotten airstrip, Lakewood Regional Airport. A name that meant nothing to most travelers, but to men like Elijah Brooks, it meant caution. It meant quiet dangers wrapped in small-town uniforms and polite words with knives underneath. The wheels kissed the runway harder than usual. The cabin shuddered. The lights flickered once before settling. Passengers grumbled, collecting their belongings, eager to leave this strange detour behind. Only Elijah sat unmoving, his eyes locked on the exit door, his instincts humming like a taut wire. The plane rolled to a stop far from any visible terminal. No jet bridge extended toward them. No bustling ground crew swarmed with luggage carts. Only a single police cruiser idling in the distance, its lights off, its presence undeniable. The intercom crackled again. Captain Morris's voice, forced into calmness, filled the cabin. Due to protocol requirements at this facility, security officers will be boarding the plane momentarily. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until further instructions. Passengers exchanged confused looks. This wasn't normal. This wasn't routine. A few instinctively reached for phones again. A few simply stared straight ahead, pretending this wasn't happening. Elijah knew better. He had been trained to see the shape of a storm before the first raindrop fell. The forward door opened with a harsh metallic groan. Two uniformed officers stepped onto the plane, one older, thick in the shoulders, moving with slow authority, the other younger, eyes darting nervously from row to row. Their gaze scanned the cabin briefly and locked instantly onto Elijah Brooks. No hesitation, no confusion. It was clear who they had come for. The older officer stepped forward, one hand resting near the baton on his belt. "Sir," he called out, voice roughened by cigarettes and small-town certainty, "we need to speak with you." Passengers stiffened, heads swiveled. Claire Whitmore peeked from behind the galley curtain, her face pale. Elijah stood slowly, deliberately, every movement controlled. He turned to face the officers, squarely, feet shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed and visible. "What's the charge?" he asked. Voice calm. The officer shifted his weight. "Security concerns." He said vaguely, "Need to ask you a few questions off the aircraft." "Security concerns." Again, the blanket excuse tossed out like a shroud. Elijah scanned the cabin, once registering the shifting eyes, the held breaths, the unspoken fear. He could fight, could demand answers here now. But he knew how this game was played. Fighting in the aisle would only feed the narrative they wanted to build. No, he would walk, but he would walk his way, with dignity intact, with the truth burning steady in his chest. Without a word, Elijah picked up his folded orders from the seat pocket, slid them into his jacket, straightened his back, and walked. Each step down the narrow aisle felt like a drum beat. Heavy measured passengers leaned away from him as he passed, some out of fear, some out of shame. A little girl clutched her mother's hand, tightly watching with wide, confused eyes. The mother pulled her closer, whispering something Elijah didn't need to hear to understand. "Not today," little one, Elijah thought as he passed. Today you will remember something else, not a criminal, not a threat, a man, a soldier, a brother keeping his word. As he reached the front, the officers flanked him, one to his left, one to his right, a quiet escort of suspicion. They guided him down the stairs onto the tarmac, cold night air, cutting sharp against his skin. The world out here was different, empty, exposed. No bustling crowd to bear witness, no live stream to catch injustice before it bloomed. But Elijah didn't need an audience to stand tall. He had been standing tall long before they knew his name. The officers led him toward the waiting cruiser. Its engine idled low, rumbling like a warning. At the last moment before they reached the car, the older officer hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty. Maybe, or maybe just the slow realization that this wasn't what they had been told. It would be. "You got ID?" the officer asked gruffly. Elijah reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out his military credentials, held them out. The officer snatched them roughly, flipped through, read, paused. His jaw tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, because now he knew. The first strike is never about the truth. It's about power, about seeing if you'll fold, if you'll bow, if you'll apologize for taking up space. But Elijah Brooks didn't fold, didn't bow, didn't apologize. He simply waited because he understood better than anyone. The first strike might hit hard, but the war was still his to win. Some battles end with explosions, some with silence, but the cruelest ones end with humiliation, where the enemy isn't aiming for your body, they're aiming for your soul. On the cold tarmac under the indifferent floodlights, Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks stood steady, his boots firm against the cracked concrete, his shadow long and unwavering behind him. The older officer still held Elijah's military credentials in his rough hand, flipping them over again and again, as if hoping to find something wrong, something dirty hidden in the folds of a lifetime of service. But there was nothing, nothing except the truth. And still the officer hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the terminal, waiting, expecting backup, perhaps permission to finish what had been started. The younger officer shifted from foot to foot, avoiding Elijah's gaze. He already knew he had seen enough, but he wasn't the one calling the shots. Not yet. Minutes passed, long, heavy minutes. The night air grew colder, biting into Elijah's skin through the heavy fabric of his dress. Blues, he could feel it happening. The shift, the subtle recalibration. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. This wasn't about procedures. This was about making an example, about putting a man like him, a black man in a position of honor, back into the place some people still thought he belonged, and they were going to do it the oldest way they knew how. Publicly, ruthlessly, under the pretense of protocol. A door slammed somewhere behind him. More footsteps approached. Elijah turned slightly, his eyes catching the gleam of a badge. Another officer, a woman this time, tall and lean, her blonde ponytail snapping behind her like a banner. She walked with the certainty of someone who already believed the worst, someone who didn't need evidence, only opportunity. The older officer handed her Elijah's ID without a word. She barely glanced at it, then turned those cold blue eyes onto Elijah. "You're going to need to come with us," she said, loud enough for the entire ground crew to hear, loud enough for the handful of lingering passengers watching from the terminal windows to see Elijah didn't move. "On what grounds?" he asked calmly. The woman's lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Failure to comply with airport security protocols, suspicious behavior, possible impersonation. Each accusation like a slap across the face, each word designed to cut deeper than the last. The goal was never justice. The goal was never truth. The goal was humiliation, strip the dignity, question the identity, make the uniform meaningless, make the man inside invisible. A rumble of noise rose from the distant terminal. Passengers pressed against the windows, some pulling out phones recording shaky videos through the glass. They would see a soldier in dress blues being surrounded by police. But without sound, without context, it would be easy to twist the story later. Disruptive passenger security concern, possible threat. 3 words away from erasing a lifetime of service. 3 lies away from making Elijah Brooks just another headline buried under a flood of misinformation. The woman officer stepped closer, hand brushing the cuffs at her belt. Last chance, she said. Elijah's heart thudded once heavy and low. He had a choice: fight now and feed their narrative, or endure and trust the truth to outlast the shame. He thought of Noah Carter, of the mother waiting by the door clutching a folded flag she didn't want, of the boy who would never make it to his 20th birthday. He owed him more than anger. He owed him silence strong enough to shake the earth. "I'll cooperate," Elijah said, voice steady as granite. "But you're making a mistake you can't erase." The woman didn't flinch, didn't blink. She had heard words like that before, and ignored them before. She gestured to the cruiser. The older officer grabbed Elijah's arm. Not hard, not brutal, but firm enough to make the message clear. "You don't belong here, you never did." They marched him across the open concrete, a parade of disgrace under the floodlights. Some ground crew members paused their wrenches and baggage carts forgotten. Some laughed quietly behind hands. Some simply turned away. The humiliation wasn't in the arrest. It wasn't in the words. It was in the looks. The way they looked at him now, not as a protector, not as a soldier, but as a problem, as something to be cleaned up. They feared the uniform. They feared the color of the man inside it. And when fear speaks louder than truth, humiliation becomes the language of power. But power, real power, is not what they think it is. And Elijah Brooks was about to show them that the door of the cruiser slammed shut with a hollow finality. Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks sat in the back seat, hands uncuffed but pinned between his knees, the leather sticking to his uniform from the cold sweat gathering along his spine. Outside, the 2 officers conferred in hushed tones, casting quick glances toward the car, making sure their conversation stayed between them and the wind. Their body language said everything: indecision, doubt, and something deeper, fear of having pushed too far. Inside the car, Elijah stared out the window. The airport loomed ahead in the distance, all neon lights and steel skeletons, a symbol of modern America shining bright on the surface, hiding cracks underneath. He caught his reflection faintly mirrored against the glass, the blue of his uniform, the glint of metals over his heart, the brown skin beneath it all. Not even the armor of honor could protect him here. Not today. Minutes dragged by like heavy chains. No one said anything. No one moved. Elijah counted his breathing the way he had learned to during survival training. In through the nose, slow and deep. Out through the mouth, controlled and deliberate. The body betrayed you faster than the mind if you let fear in, and he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. Not here, not now. He had survived too much to fold inside a patrol car. Finally, the passenger door creaked open. The younger officer, the one with restless eyes, slid into the front seat. He shifted awkwardly, avoiding Elijah's gaze through the rearview mirror. "We're verifying your information," he said, voice stiff, rehearsed. Standard protocol. Standard protocol." The words felt like a bad joke by now. Elijah said nothing. Just kept staring straight ahead past the man, past the steering wheel into a horizon only he could see. The younger officer cleared his throat, tapping nervously on the dashboard. "You served long?" he asked suddenly, voice quieter, almost human. Elijah tilted his head slightly. 22 years, he said, voice steady. 8 deployments, a pause. The officer shifted again. "My uncle was Army," he muttered. "Retired out of Fort Bragg." Elijah nodded once, slow and deliberate. Brotherhood even now, even here, some lines ran deeper than fear. Outside, the older officer finished his call, his jaw set tight. He walked back toward the cruiser, each step heavier than the last. He opened Elijah's door, roughly making a point to keep control to remind everyone who still held the keys. Out, he barked. Elijah stepped out slowly, measured, unrushed. The floodlights overhead bathed the small parking lot in sterile white. Somewhere the hum of another plane taking off rumbled across the night sky. The older officer shoved Elijah's credentials back into his hand. "You're clear," he said, voice flat, no charges, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. Just two words meant to erase the hour they'd stolen from him. Clear as if he had been dirty before, as if honor needed their permission to exist. They wanted it to end here. Tidy forgotten. Another small injustice swallowed by a long line of bigger ones. But humiliation doesn't wash away that easily. It lingers, it stains, and sometimes it ignites. As Elijah tucked his papers away, a movement caught his eye. Beyond the fence outside the secured lot, a small crowd had gathered. Travelers, ground crew. Even a few flight attendants from other airlines' phones were raised. Recordings, blinking in the dark, like dozens of tiny, unblinking eyes they had seen. Maybe not everything. Maybe not enough to understand the full weight of it. But they had seen enough to know something was wrong. Enough to know dignity was under attack. The older officer shifted uncomfortably under the silent scrutiny. He tugged at his belt, adjusted his cap, cleared his throat. "You're free to return to your airline," he said curtly, as if it was a favor. Elijah gave a slow nod. No smile, no thank you. Just quiet acknowledgement and a promise sealed behind his eyes. "You don't get to bury this." He turned his back on the officers walking calmly toward the waiting terminal in the distance. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from defeat, but from the weight of every man who had ever been forced to bow their head just to make it home alive. Not today. Elijah Brooks wasn't bowing for anyone. He wasn't just walking back to an airport. He was walking back to reclaim his story, and this time everyone was watching. Humiliation is a weapon forged from fear, but dignity, real stubborn dignity, is bulletproof. And the story of Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks was far from over. The long walk back to the terminal felt heavier than any march Elijah Brooks had ever endured. Not because of distance, but because of what had been stolen from him in the span of an hour. It wasn't just time. It was the slow erosion of dignity, the quiet theft of something sacred. But Elijah walked anyway. Boots steady on cracked concrete, head high beneath the sterile glare of the security lights, because the only thing worse than humiliation was surrender, and Elijah Brooks did not surrender. As he approached the terminal doors, the crowd outside thickened. Some clutched coffee cups, some clutched phones, most clutched their silence. Whispers stirred like dry leaves against the building walls. "That's the guy. Did you see what they did?" Manny didn't even raise his voice. A few people stepped aside to clear his path. Not out of fear, out of something else. Recognition, respect. The kind that wasn't given easily. The kind that had to be earned. The kind that had to be fought for without throwing a single punch. Inside the terminal buzzed with artificial brightness, fluorescent lights humming overhead, flight announcements rolling out like mechanical prayers. The gate agent, a different woman this time, older, grayer, with the look of someone who had seen too much and said too little, straightened as Elijah approached. For a moment she hesitated, hands fluttering over her keyboard. Then she nodded once and printed a new boarding pass without a word. She slid it across the counter carefully, as if offering a fragile apology. She didn't have permission to speak aloud. Elijah accepted it with a nod. No anger, no triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. Sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken. Sometimes it's just a refusal to carry someone else's shame. The new flight was boarding already. Rows of passengers shuffled forward, anxious to escape the uncomfortable reality they had just witnessed. Some offered small smiles, tight, guilty things that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. A few reached out tiny gestures of solidarity, a hand briefly resting on his arm. A murmured, "Thank you for your service," that sounded more like "I'm sorry." Elijah took them all in, every clumsy kindness, every guilty glance. He didn't need their apologies. He didn't need their permission. The only forgiveness that mattered was the one he carried inside his chest. The promise to himself that no matter how small they tried to make him feel, he would never shrink. Not an inch. Not for them. Not for anyone. He boarded the plane without fanfare, no calls for special treatment, no looks demanding recognition. Just a man doing what he came here to do. Seat 14A this time. Window seat, mid-cabin. No ceremony. He sat down slowly, resting his orders on his lap. Hands steady breath, even outside the window. The world blurred under the floodlights. Baggage carts rolled by. Fuel trucks hissed and groaned. Ground crew moved like ants across a vast concrete plain. And somewhere below, deep in the belly of this plane, the flag-draped casket waited, silent, patient, just like him. Humiliation is a strange kind of violence. It doesn't bleed, it doesn't bruise, but it lingers. Long after fists would have healed, it wraps around your ribs, it steals your breath, it carves doubts into the places no one else can see, but only if you let it. And Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks had no intention of letting it. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the fuselage, a low, steady rumble that shook the very bones of the plane. Passengers leaned back in their seats. Flight attendants moved through safety demonstrations with mechanical precision. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, and in that silence he remembered. He remembered why he wore the uniform. Not for medals, not for ceremonies, for the men like Noah Carter, for promises made under a burning sun and a ragged flag, for the belief that dignity once earned could not be stripped away by uniforms or badges or cold fluorescent lights. It lived deeper than skin, deeper than circumstance. It lived in the choice to stand, to endure, to walk through fire without letting it touch your soul. The plane lurched forward, racing down the runway, and as the wheels lifted off the earth as gravity loosened its grip, Elijah felt a different kind of freedom settle over him. Not the kind they granted, not the kind they could take back. The kind he had forged inch by inch, moment by brutal moment. The kind no humiliation could touch. They tried to break him with silence, with suspicion, with shame. But Elijah Brooks knew the oldest truth there is. You don't defeat a man by making him kneel. You defeat him only when he forgets how to stand. And Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks had never forgotten. There's a moment in every storm when the rain stops whispering and starts to roar, when the line between inconvenience and injustice snaps clean in two, when what was hidden becomes undeniable. For Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, that moment was about to hit harder than any battlefield. The plane touched down at Monroe National Airport under a low ceiling of heavy clouds. The wheels kissed the tarmac harder than usual, jolting passengers awake from restless half-sleeps. Elijah remained still, his body long accustomed to turbulence. It was the quiet turbulence he knew to fear more, the kind that twisted below the surface, the kind that always came after humiliation, the kind that smelled like unfinished business. The captain's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have been asked to hold at the gate momentarily due to an ongoing security situation inside the terminal. We appreciate your patience." Passengers groaned, rolled their eyes, muttered about missed connections and lost meetings. But Elijah Brooks knew better. Security situation. He had seen those two words used like knives before. Not to protect, to control, to punish. And this time, he was the reason those words were being spoken. As the minutes dragged, Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. One message, unknown number. Blocked caller ID. He opened it. Only 4 words. "We know who you are. No punctuation, no name, no need. The meaning was clear enough. It wasn't about mistaken identity anymore. It wasn't about security concerns. It was personal, calculated, designed to rattle his foundation. But Elijah had walked through fire before, and he had no intention of crumbling now. When humiliation doesn't break a man, fear is the next weapon. Fear that comes dressed like a warning. Fear that pretends to care for your safety, even as it circles like a vulture overhead. 30 minutes later, the plane finally taxied to the gate. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, mechanical smiles glued onto their faces, thanking passengers who no longer cared. When it came Elijah's turn to disembark, he stood slowly, careful not to rush. Careful not to give them anything they could twist into a threat. One step at a time. One breath at a time. Boots steady on the narrow aisle carpet. At the jet bridge, 2 airport security officers waited. Different uniforms this time. Different faces, same intent. Sergeant Brooks, one of them asked, voice pretending neutrality. "We'll need you to come with us." Not a request, not quite an order. A gray space designed to trap a man who dared to think he was free. Elijah nodded once. No argument, no submission, just acknowledgement. He followed them wordlessly into a back hallway, sterile and humming with the low buzz of hidden cameras and flickering fluorescent lights. The walk felt endless, every step a silent dare flinch. Lose your temper, prove them right. He didn't flinch, he didn't break. They led him into a small room, a makeshift security office, all gray walls and scratched metal furniture. A single chair waited in the center like an accusation. Elijah stood instead, planting his feet shoulder-width apart, refusing the quiet humiliation of sitting like a suspect. The older officer, a sergeant judging by the chevrons on his sleeve, leaned against the far wall. Arms crossed, "We received a report," the officer said casually as if they were discussing lost luggage. "Possible impersonation of a federal escort. Discrepancies in documentation. A lie, a thin one, tissue paper over a wound they didn't want the public to see." The line wasn't just crossed, it was erased. They weren't trying to protect anyone. They weren't investigating anything. They were retaliating, punishing a man for daring to walk too proudly in a world that wasn't ready to honor the skin he wore. Elijah reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, pulled out his papers, held them up between 2 fingers. The movement deliberate and unmistakably non-threatening. "Everything you need is here," he said. The officer didn't reach for them, didn't even look. Instead, he smiled thinly. "This isn't about paperwork anymore," he said. A chill threaded down Elijah's spine. He had heard those words before. Not in airports, not in courts, on dusty roads halfway around the world. From the mouths of men who had no flag, no uniform, no honor, only hatred. And now he heard it here. Home. Some wars don't wear camouflage. They wear badges, they wear suits. They smile when they gut you, but no uniform, no badge, no smile can hide injustice forever. And Elijah Brooks wasn't done fighting yet. Not by a long shot. There's a kind of violence that leaves no bruises, no broken bones, no screaming headlines. It moves in whispers, it lives in paperwork, it hides behind polite smiles, and sometimes it wears a badge. Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks remained standing in that cramped security room, his hands steady at his sides as the officers circled him like sharks smelling blood. The older sergeant leaned forward, the chair beneath him, groaning with the shift of his weight. "You see," he said, tapping the table slowly when someone refuses a reasonable request, "we have to ask ourselves, what are they hiding?" His words oozed false patience. Each syllable meant to poke, to prod, to find a crack in Elijah's armor. Elijah didn't respond, didn't blink. Let silence do the heavy lifting, because sometimes silence was the loudest weapon a man could carry. The younger officer tried a different angle. He pulled out his tablet, tapped it a few times, then slid it across the table toward Elijah. A photo grainy zoomed in, a blurry still frame from the terminal surveillance footage showing Elijah standing at the gate papers in hand. The officer tapped the screen dramatically. "This you?" he asked, as if Elijah might suddenly confess to impersonating himself. Elijah gave a single nod. Short, precise. The officer shrugged as if disappointed. "Well," he said, sitting back, it doesn't look good. Man in uniform, security concerns public disturbance." "We got to be thorough, public disturbance." That phrase again elastic enough to stretch over anything they wanted to crush. When they can't find a crime, they create one piece by piece, lie by lie, until the truth drowns under the weight of their fear. The older sergeant rose from his chair and stepped closer. His boots stopped inches from Elijah's, close enough to feel the heat of challenge. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, voice low, threatening, without raising the volume. "You could be on your way already. You could be eating dinner, catching a cab, whatever you want. Instead, you're standing here, wasting everyone's time." Elijah finally spoke. 5 words measured. "Even I'm not wasting anything." The sergeant smirked, shaking his head like a teacher disappointed by a stubborn student. "You people never learn," he muttered under his breath. The words hung there. Undeniable ugly. There it was. The truth they kept hidden behind paperwork, behind fake smiles, behind the illusion of protocol. Not fear of a threat. Fear of a man who refused to be small. Fear of a man who wore his pride on his skin. The younger officer glanced nervously between Elijah and his partner. He didn't sign up for this. He wanted the easy job, the kind where everyone said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and apologized for existing. Instead, he was standing in a room with a man who wouldn't bow, and every second of silence was making it harder to pretend they were doing the right thing. Finally, the door opened. Another man entered, this one in a suit, thin-frame glasses, perched on the bridge of his nose, a lanyard around his neck, flashing some agency badge too quickly to read. His voice was crisp. "Efficient Sergeant Brooks," he said, nodding curtly. "I'm Special Agent Raymond from Homeland Security, mind. If we have a word, mind. If we have a word." As if Elijah had a choice, as if any of this was a conversation. Still, Elijah nodded. Polite, measured, always. Agent Raymond set down a slim laptop bag and flipped it open, pulled out a single sheet of paper, laid it flat on the table. "This is a formal notice of an investigative review," he said, tapping the paper once. "Due to anomalies in your identification process at the prior airport, we're placing your travel privileges under immediate suspension until verification is complete." The words were legal, polished, practiced. Elijah understood them instantly. You're not arrested. You're not convicted, but you're trapped. Rooted in a bureaucracy designed to drain you dry. And worse, they were going after his name now, his service, his record. When they realize they can't beat your spirit, they go after your history. They smear the story you fought to build piece by piece, word by word, until the world no longer remembers who you were, only who they say you are. Elijah met Agent Raymond's gaze squarely. "On whose authority?" he asked. The agent smiled thinly. "The department's a lie, but an official lie signed, sealed, delivered. And in America, sometimes that was enough." The sergeant leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, watching, waiting for Elijah to crack, to raise his voice, to lash out, waiting for the proof they so desperately wanted, the proof that the dignity he carried was only skin deep. But Elijah didn't crack. He simply folded his hands behind his back, standing at parade rest, eyes forward, shoulders square, silent, unbending. Because they could take the paperwork, they could smear the name, but they could never steal the truth written into the bones of a man who had learned to survive storms bigger than this. The line was crossed, not in a burst of violence, but in 1,000 quiet cuts. And when they were done cutting, They would look up one day and realize the only thing they had truly wounded was themselves. They crossed the line not with sirens, not with handcuffs, but with paper and silence and 1,000 tiny humiliations designed to teach a man one thing: stay small. But Elijah Brooks had never been small. Not when it mattered, not now. Agent Raymond clicked his pen once, twice, filling the small room with a sharp staccato rhythm. "You'll remain here while we complete the verification process," he said coolly. "Could be a few hours, could be overnight. Depends how fast DC responds. A few hours, a night, maybe longer." Not because Elijah had done anything wrong, but because someone needed to show that defiance had consequences. The sergeant by the door smirked openly now, finally tasting what he thought was victory. The younger officer looked less sure. He fiddled with the strap of his radio, glancing at Elijah every few seconds, as if seeing something he hadn't wanted to see when this all started. Something like shame. Elijah said nothing. He stood there breathing slow, and even his hands relaxed behind his back. His stance saying more than any words ever could. He wasn't asking. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging. He was enduring, and they hated him for it, because deep down they knew no matter how many papers they filed, no matter how many accusations they whispered, they would never own him. Minutes blurred into hours. The fluorescent lights above buzzed harsh and unkind. The clock on the wall ticked, dragging time like a dying animal. No food, no water, no answers, just the waiting, the endless grinding, waiting. The slow burn they hoped would make him crack, but Elijah had survived worse in deserts where the sun felt like fire against your skin, in jungles where the night whispered death with every breath, in cities where promises were broken faster than they were made. This was nothing. This was just another battlefield, and Elijah Brooks knew how to survive battlefields. Patience isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the sharpening of a blade they can't see until it's too late. Hours later, the door creaked open again. Another man entered, different this time. Civilian suit, steel gray hair, eyes like stone. He carried no badge, no title, just authority that didn't need announcing. He surveyed the room once, saw. Elijah saw the officers, saw everything, and frowned deeply. "Sergeant Major Brooks," he said, voice clipped. "My name is Deputy Director Marcus Hall, Homeland Internal Affairs." The air shifted. The smug smirk slipped from the sergeant's face. The younger officer stood a little straighter. Agent Raymond visibly stiffened. Whatever game they thought they were playing, it had just changed. Hal walked right up to Elijah and extended his hand. "Apologies," he said simply, "for the disgraceful treatment you've endured today." Elijah hesitated a fraction of a second, then shook his hand firmly, his face unreadable. It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Hall turned to face the officers. His voice dropped into something cold and precise. "I'll be requiring a full report of this incident immediately, including the unauthorized detainment, false security alerts, and the illegal suspension of a federal military escort order." Each word landed like a hammer blow. Unauthorized, false, illegal. Truth unleashed at last. Agent Raymond paled. The younger officer looked like he might be sick. Even the older sergeant, the one who thought humiliation was a game, had the good sense to look down at his boots. "Hall wasn't finished. You will escort Sergeant Major Brooks to his flight. You will do so with full honors, due his station, and you will do so without delay." The finality in his voice left no room for argument, no room for excuses. When you build your power on lies, it only takes one truth to tear it down. Escorted now, but not as a prisoner, as a man wronged but unbroken, Elijah Brooks walked back through the terminal, this time heads turned for a different reason. Not suspicion, not fear, respect. Quiet, real earned. The final boarding call echoed overhead. Elijah climbed the jet bridge without a glance backward. No bitterness, no rage, Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had tried to bury him. But he was not a seed. He was the storm. When they cross the line, they think they've won. But sometimes crossing the line doesn't weaken the one standing. It strengthens him. And for Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, the real fight was just beginning. There's a silence deeper than humiliation, deeper than fear. It's the silence before the storm hits back, before the shadow rises from the ground you thought was dead and forgotten. And when that shadow wakes, no apology can stop it. Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks sat in seat 3A again, back on the plane, the world moving around him like background noise. The ground crew outside hustled with renewed energy, their movements sharper, more deliberate. Passengers boarded with heads low, some offering quick apologetic glances his way. Others kept their eyes firmly forward, pretending none of it had happened. It didn't matter. Elijah wasn't here for them. He had a promise to keep a brother to deliver home. A battle to finish. The engines rumbled to life under the wings. The flight attendant, a new one, a young black man with careful eyes, offered Elijah a silent nod of acknowledgement as he moved down the aisle. For the first time in hours, Elijah allowed himself a breath, not of relief, but of readiness, because he knew this wasn't over, not even close. Some fights don't end when the fist stops swinging. They end when the truth finds its voice, when the ones who move in silence finally step into the light. And Elijah Brooks wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Somewhere far from the airport, noise in a house lined with old books and heavy oak furniture, a phone rang. It was answered on the third ring. A voice, calm, low, powerful, came through the receiver. "He's been tut," the voice said simply. A pause. Then another voice even deeper. Not acceptable, not anger, not panic, just certainty. The kind that made empires tremble without a single shot fired. Back at Monroe National, and the executive offices above the terminal phones started ringing too. Fast, urgent executives scrambled, their faces turning pale as messages stacked up faster than explanations could be invented. Senators were calling, generals were calling, directors from three-letter agencies were calling, and all of them were asking the same question. What the hell happened to Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks? You can laugh at a man, you can mock a man, you can even try to erase a man. But when you humiliate the wrong soldier, when you touch the wrong warrior, you wake the shadow that stands behind him, the quiet power, the unseen hand, the old warriors who never forget and never forgive. In a quiet federal building outside D.C., another figure stood tall, impeccably dressed, eyes cold enough to freeze fire. He stared at the report on his desk, pages of bureaucratic nonsense stacked on top of one sacred truth. One of theirs had been disrespected, and the system would answer for it. Orders were issued that night, not shouted, not broadcast, whispered, signed, sealed. And once the machine began moving, there was no stopping it, because behind Elijah, Brooks stood more than just a folded flag, more than a grieving mother. Behind him stood generations of silent power, built on sacrifice, built on blood, built on the unbreakable code. No one touches family without consequence. You may not see the shadow, you may not hear it coming, but once it's awake, you'll never outrun it. And tonight the shadow was wide awake. At the airport, the gate agents received a sudden update. The flight path changed. The landing crew was replaced. Security was doubled, but not for fear of Elijah Brooks. For fear of what would happen if one more mistake was made. Somewhere in the control room, a supervisor stared at his monitor, sweating through his shirt without knowing exactly why. All he knew was this: don't touch him, don't look at him wrong, don't even breathe in his direction. Because someone far above his pay grade was watching now, and the margin for error had shrunk to zero. Elijah sat quietly, hands folded, eyes closed. He didn't know the phone calls that were being made. He didn't know the orders flying across secure channels faster than the speed of regret. He didn't have to, because when you walk in truth long enough, When you carry honor like a shield through every room, they try to shut you out of the shadow walks with you, even when you don't see it. Especially then, when the shadow wakes, it's not here to scare you. It's here to remind you some names are carved into stone, and some battles are bigger than one man. Elijah Brooks had fought alone for a long time, but not anymore. Now the whole mountain was moving behind him. The thing about silent power is this: it doesn't roar when it moves. It doesn't demand to be seen. It just changes the temperature of the room until everyone feels it. And tonight, the temperature was dropping fast. At Monroe National Airport, things shifted subtly but unmistakably. The same officers who once moved with lazy arrogance now kept their heads low, their radios crackling with clipped anxious updates. Supervisors whispered behind glass doors, phones buzzed without end. Something was happening, something no one could see but everyone could feel. Elijah Brooks had become more than a passenger, more than an inconvenience. He had become a message, a litmus test. And those in power understood what failure meant now. Because when the shadow wakes, it doesn't ask twice. A sleek black SUV pulled onto the restricted tarmac, unnoticed by most, but eyed nervously by a few. Inside, Deputy Director Marcus Hall adjusted his cufflinks and stepped out, ignoring the stiff salutes from airport security. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Elijah Brooks. He was here to fix a mistake that should have never happened. Inside the plane, Elijah sat calmly, unaware of the currents swirling around him. His hands rested on his lap, the boarding pass tucked between his fingers like a final, silent proof of who he was. He didn't need their permission. He didn't need their validation. All he needed was the truth, and the truth was moving toward him fast. Sometimes the most powerful armies are invisible, built not of soldiers, but of silence, not of weapons, but of will. And once they choose to move, the world shifts beneath their feet. Deputy Director Hall moved through the jet bridge without waiting for clearance. His ID flashed once at the startled gate agent, but no words were exchanged. There was no need. He boarded the aircraft, scanning quickly, finding Elijah instantly. A figure alone in a sea of restless passengers, a man who had refused to break Hall, approached his polished shoes soundless on the carpet. Passengers watched curiously, sensing something rare unfolding, but not understanding what it was. Hall stopped in front of Elijah's seat, offering a hand in greeting Sergeant Major Brooks. He said, voice low but carrying, on behalf of the department and this nation, I offer my personal apology. The cabin fell into a hush. Even the hum of the engines seemed to dim for a moment. Elijah looked up slowly, measured the man, measured the moment. He didn't rush, didn't leap to accept, because respect once broken didn't mend easily. But after a breath, Elijah reached out, shook Hall's hand firmly, his face steady, unreadable. He wasn't forgiving, not yet, but he was acknowledging. Hall leaned in slightly, speaking quieter now, just for Elijah's ears. You are cleared for immediate departure, he said. Your escort status has been reinstated with full honors. He hesitated, then added with rare sincerity, and the individuals responsible for today's events are being dealt with permanently. The weight behind that last word needed no explanation. The shadow had moved and someone was about to feel its full weight. This wasn't kindness, it wasn't charity. It was respect paid like a debt long overdue. Because the truth once awakened demands more than apologies, it demands action. Hall straightened, gave Elijah a final nod of respect, and exited the aircraft as silently as he had entered. The ripple he left behind lingered long after he disappeared down the jet bridge. Passengers whispered among themselves, piecing together fragments of a story too big to fit neatly into rumors. But Elijah didn't move, didn't explain. He just settled back into his seat. Hands folded, eyes steady on the horizon outside the window. The plane pushed back from the gate minutes later, gliding onto the taxiway with a new urgency, not rushed, not hurried, purposeful. as if even the engines now understood whose journey they carried. When the shadow wakes, it doesn't fight for headlines. It fights for the silent promises made in blood and sacrifice. It fights for the ones who stood when standing meant everything. And tonight the world had remembered something it had almost forgotten. You do not touch a man like Elijah Brooks. Without awakening an army, you cannot see. When a man walks alone into a storm, it's easy to mistake his silence for weakness, his patience for surrender, his endurance for defeat. But real storms don't roar when they start. They gather, they thicken, they move beneath the surface until the moment they decide to break the sky open. The plane lifted off from Monroe National Airport wheels tucking beneath the belly of the craft as it soared into the night. Inside, Elijah Brooks sat silent, the steady vibration of the engines beneath him. The world below blurred into darkness. But Elijah wasn't thinking about the ground. He wasn't thinking about the ones who tried to drag him down there. He was thinking about what came next. Because once a shadow wakes, it doesn't simply go back to sleep. The phone tucked into Elijah's jacket vibrated softly. He ignored it at first. Another buzz, another. Finally, he slipped it free. One new message from a contact he didn't recognize. A simple text. We stand with you. No name, no signature. But Elijah understood he wasn't alone anymore. His story had already begun to travel beyond airport walls, beyond terminals, beyond bureaucracies. It was slipping between the cracks of power like light through a broken dam. Silent power doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for the world to be ready. It moves through the bones of a people who remember every time they were told they were less, every time they were asked to bow, every time they were told to wait, and when it moves, there is no stopping it. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Passengers stirred, reclaiming small comforts. Elijah remained still. He wasn't restless. He was rooted, like an old oak standing against a hurricane. Not untouched, but unbroken, always unbroken. 3 rows back, a young black boy leaned into the aisle, peeking toward Elijah. Maybe 9 or 10 years old, his mother reached for him, automatically pulling him back, whispering caution. But the boy wriggled free just enough to wave, small shy. Hopefully Elijah caught the motion out of the corner of his eye, turned, nodded once. A silent salute between generations, between what had been survived and what still had to be won. The shadow doesn't wake just for revenge. It wakes for the next child watching. It wakes for the promise whispered in the blood of ancestors. You will not inherit silence. You will inherit strength. At the front of the plane, the captain's door cracked open. A figure appeared. The captain himself, a tall man, mid-50s, with worn lines around his eyes, and a bearing that spoke of some kind of service once rendered long ago. He didn't approach Elijah directly. Not at first. He paused in the aisle, adjusting his jacket as if weighing the moment. Then he moved one step, another, until he stood beside Elijah's seat. The cabin quieted again, passengers pretending not to stare. The captain lowered his voice, but the words carried Sergeant Major Brooks. He said, voice thick with something too heavy to name, "It's an honor to have you on board. We owe you better than what you were given." No flowery speech, no corporate script, just a man speaking to another man. Truth meeting truth in the narrow aisle of a metal bird cutting across the sky. Elijah looked up, held the man's gaze for a long moment, then he nodded once. Because some apologies don't need to be shouted, they only need to be said and heard. The captain moved back to the cockpit. The world inside the plane shifted again. A little less heavy, a little less broken. Passengers leaned back into their seats. They're breathing easier somehow. Maybe they didn't understand everything they had witnessed. Maybe they never would, but they had seen enough to know this wasn't just another flight. It was a story, an awakening, a reckoning. When the shadow wakes, it doesn't scream. It doesn't destroy blindly. It simply rises, and when it rises, it lifts everyone who thought they had no wings left. Elijah turned his head, staring out the window again. The stars stretched endless across the night sky, sharp and cold and impossibly bright. Somewhere below them, systems were scrambling. People were drafting statements, crafting denials, covering tracks. It didn't matter because you can't outrun a story once it finds its voice. You can't silence the mountain once it remembers it can move. And tonight, the mountain had moved. Not for revenge, not for rage, but for every promise whispered across 1,000 forgotten battlefields, for every name etched into stone, for every boy who dared to believe dignity could still mean something. The shadow had woken, and it would not sleep again. When the mountain moves, those who built their castles on sand are the first to fall. And at Monroe National Airport, the sand was already crumbling fast. It didn't happen with sirens. It didn't happen with headlines. It happened in whispers, first, then in meetings, held behind closed doors and calls, answered with trembling hands in careers, ending quietly before the sun even rose. The fall had begun. Inside a cold, windowless conference room, deep inside the airport administration wing, a group of executives sat stiffly around a polished oak table. The room smelled of burnt coffee, desperation, and fear. At the head of the table sat Alan Myers, director of airport operations, the same man who had greenlit the detention of Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks. The same man who had, with a shrug and a wink, decided that humiliation could be hidden beneath the folds of bureaucracy. Now his phone buzzed uncontrollably against the tabletop. Again and again, messages piling up faster than excuses. One message stood out, a simple subject line: immediate termination, meeting scheduled, 7 a.m., no explanation, no negotiation. Alan's fingers trembled slightly as he silenced the buzzing phone. He glanced up at the others around the table: PR directors, security managers, department heads. Their faces were pale, sweaty. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood the silent power they had mocked, had awakened, and it was sweeping through their world like a firestorm. The fall is never loud at first. It's quiet. It's 1,000 tiny cracks in the walls you thought were unbreakable. It's the slow realization that the ground you built your power on was never yours to command. Across the city at the Regional Homeland Security Office, Special Agent Raymond sat at his desk staring blankly at the letter on his computer screen. Effective immediately, your security clearance has been revoked, pending full investigation. He read it twice, 3 times. It didn't change. The shadows had reached even here. He leaned back heavily in his chair, the wheels creaking beneath him, the stale taste of failure coating his mouth. He had thought Elijah Brooks was just another problem to be pushed aside, another story that would dissolve before the world noticed. He had been wrong, fatally wrong. At a coffee shop near the terminal, Claire Whitmore sat hunched over her laptop, scrolling through social media feeds that burned with rage she hadn't expected to face. Honor Elijah Brooks' silent power, respect the uniform. Her face flushed as she read post after post. Imagine treating a soldier like that in his own country. You can't erase dignity with suspicion. We stand with Sergeant Major Brooks. Every video, every photo, every whispered retelling of the moment she had asked for Elijah's papers, it was all there now for the world to see, and it would never be unseen. You can humiliate a man in front of a few. You can make him kneel for a minute. But when you do it wrong, when you pick the wrong man, you don't just shame him. You shame yourself for everyone to witness, and the world does not easily forgive what it sees in daylight. By noon, media trucks had parked outside Monroe National. Reporters shouted questions through the glass doors. Airport staff hurried past cameras, heads down, desperate to become invisible. But it was too late. The story had cracked open. The fall was unstoppable now. At a press conference hastily arranged in a bland hotel conference room, Alan Myers stood stiffly at a podium, flanked by trembling PR aides. He cleared his throat once, twice, then read from a prepared statement. We regret the series of unfortunate misunderstandings surrounding the recent incident involving Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, he mumbled, but the cameras caught everything. The way his hands shook, the way his voice cracked, the way the apology sounded like an admission made at gunpoint. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Because this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. It was about betrayal, about disrespect, about forgetting that silent warriors walk among us every day, and they never walk alone. The fall isn't when they lose their jobs. It isn't when they lose their titles. The fall is when they realize they never had the power they thought they did. Not really, because real power doesn't come from paper badges and plastic smiles. It comes from truth. It comes from honor, and once awakened, it does not fall. The fall of a system doesn't always come with broken windows and flaming headlines. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's the sound of doors closing forever. The sound of careers ending with a click of a lock and the whisper of a box sliding across a desk. Sometimes it's the silence that screams the loudest. By the end of the day, Monroe National Airport wasn't just dealing with bad publicity, it was dealing with something far worse. Accountability. Federal investigators swarmed the administrative offices, internal memos leaked like cracked pipes, screenshots, emails, security footage. Every lie, every cover-up attempt, every petty act of cruelty against Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks now dragged blinking into the daylight. There was no hiding anymore, no one to shield them. Not from the truth and not from the public. Alan Myers, the once confident director of airport operations, was escorted out of the building through a side door. No speeches, no second chances, just a cardboard box clutched to his chest, filled with 15 years of arrogance, packed into framed certificates and dusty paperweights. He didn't make eye contact with the reporters, shouting questions. He didn't answer when someone yelled, "Do you regret it?" Because some regrets are too big to answer with words. It's a funny thing how quickly the mighty fall when they realize the walls they built weren't walls at all, just mirrors. And when the mirrors crack, they're forced to see themselves as they truly are. Meanwhile, Agent Raymond sat in a tiny interview room, much like the one Elijah had been forced into. Except this time, there were no handshakes, no routine checks, only a pair of stern federal investigators who asked simple questions he had no simple answers for. Why was Sergeant Major Brooks flagged? Who authorized the diversion to Lakewood Regional? Why was there no record of any legitimate security concern? Raymond sweated through his shirt. He stammered. He blamed procedures. He blamed confusion. But the truth sat in the middle of the table like a loaded gun. He had seen a black man in a place of honor and assumed danger. He had seen dignity and thought it must be deceit. And now there was no protocol thick enough to shield him. Across town, Claire Whitmore was escorted to the Human Resources office by two quiet supervisors. Her badge was deactivated, her final paycheck handed over without eye contact. There was no grand confrontation, no shouting, only the slow, humiliating realization that she wasn't being punished for one mistake. She was being held accountable for every small cruelty she thought would go unnoticed, for every moment of silent compliance, every whisper, every averted eye. And in a world where silent power had finally found its voice, that was enough to bring her down. The fall doesn't just belong to the ones who swing the hammer. It belongs to the ones who stand by and pretend they don't see. Silence isn't neutral, it's a side. And Claire had chosen hers. Back at the airport, passengers who had witnessed Elijah's mistreatment came forward. Testimonies poured in. Videos posted online gained millions of views. Ordinary people, many of them once willing to look away, now found themselves unable to stay silent. A groundswell of quiet outrage grew louder, strong enough to force statements from airline executives, airport commissions, even local politicians. Words like unacceptable, unconscionable, systemic failure filled press releases, drafted too late to matter. It wasn't enough to save reputations. It wasn't enough to erase what had been done, because the truth was already airborne, carried across state lines, across hearts and homes, and the fall couldn't be stopped now. You can delay justice. You can deny truth. You can hope the storm passes you by. But when you mock dignity, when you try to humiliate the ones who carry real power within them, the fall is inevitable. It doesn't need anger. It doesn't need violence. It only needs patience and the belief that right still matters. And for Elijah Brooks, it always mattered. As the day closed, Monroe National's once polished hallways echoed with the sound of empty offices, forgotten papers blowing across scuffed floors. The fortress had fallen, not with bombs, not with riots, but with silence sharpened into steel, with a truth too heavy to bury. Some stories don't need a hero to swing a sword. They just need one man to stand. And sometimes that's enough to make an empire fall. When systems fall, it's not because the walls crumble overnight. It's because the rot inside finally has nowhere left to hide. And at Monroe National Airport, the rot was exposed for everyone to see. The national news cycle hit like a hammer. What had begun as whispers in waiting areas and grainy cell phone videos turned into primetime coverage. Anchors leaned into the camera, their voices heavy with manufactured outrage. Decorated soldier detained in humiliated airport. Faces federal investigation panels of experts. Debated on air legal analysts, dissected policies. Veterans spoke with trembling voices about dignity, about sacrifice, about how easy it was to forget who bore the real weight of freedom. It wasn't just a scandal now, it was a reckoning. Some falls you never see coming, others you build with your own hands brick by brick, lie by lie until the whole house collapses with the weight of your own arrogance. By the end of the week, Monroe National was no longer a proud local institution. It was a cautionary tale. Flights were canceled, partnerships severed, federal grants suspended pending compliance reviews, airlines quietly rerouted major hubs elsewhere. Corporate sponsors pulled logos from terminals, not out of principle, but because the stink of failure clung too thick to scrub away. The ones who once strutted through the halls with laminated badges and smug smiles, they left through side doors, their names erased from placards faster than they had been printed. It didn't matter. The damage was permanent. The fall was total. At a quiet ceremony across town, unnoticed by cameras, a small group gathered. Not executives, not politicians. Soldiers, veterans. Families, men and women, who understood without needing words. They raised a simple plaque on a brick wall at the American Legion post in honor of Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks. A reminder that dignity is not negotiable. No speeches, no press releases, just hands pressed to cool stone, just promises spoken in the silence between heartbeats. The fall of a corrupt system isn't enough. What matters is what rises in its place. Honor memory, the quiet rebuilding of something true, something earned. And it always starts the same way, with one man refusing to bow. Meanwhile, Claire Whitmore, former gate agent, sat alone in her tiny apartment, watching the world spin beyond her reach. She refreshed job boards, clicked through rejections, watched her savings drain dollar by dollar. She told herself it wasn't fair, that she was just following orders, but deep down she knew every small cruelty she chose not to question, every quiet injustice she helped carry out, had led her here. The fall didn't care about excuses, only choices. Elsewhere, Agent Raymond faced a disciplinary review that would stretch into years of hearings and lawsuits. He would never wear a badge again, not because of a single mistake, but because of a lifetime spent believing that power excused everything, that suspicion was a weapon meant only for certain faces, certain uniforms. And when the truth finally called his bluff, he had nothing left to stand on. You don't lose everything because of one moment. You lose it because you forget that every moment matters, that dignity matters. And when you forget long enough, the fall feels sudden, but it's been coming for a long, long time. At the heart of it all, Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks remained silent. He didn't attend the protests. He didn't call into news shows. He didn't post statements on social media because he didn't have to. His story was already moving faster than any speech could catch. It moved in the hands of mothers holding their sons closer. It moved in the eyes of young soldiers standing a little taller. It moved in the prayers whispered by fathers who had carried too many folded flags home. And it moved in the quiet, unbreakable understanding between men and women who knew. Some things are worth standing for, even when standing costs you everything. The fall wasn't Elijah's victory. It wasn't his revenge. It was the world remembering that true power doesn't humiliate. True power doesn't need to crush to prove itself. True power simply stands and lets the world catch up or collapse trying. In every battle, there comes a moment, not when the dust settles, but when the truth rises, when the lesson becomes louder than the pain, more permanent than the scars. And for Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, that moment had finally arrived. The days after the fall passed differently. No more calls from reporters, no more officials scrambling to offer empty apologies, no more airport screens flashing crisis headlines. The noise faded, the cameras left, but Elijah remained quiet, steady, unmoved. Because real dignity doesn't perform for crowds. It lives in what you choose to do when no one's watching. Elijah didn't seek revenge. He didn't file lawsuits. He didn't stand in front of microphones demanding compensation. Instead, he went back to the basics, back to the silent work that builds nations, stronger than any press release. He volunteered at the local VA hospital, sat with men too broken for most to see, listened when others had stopped listening, held hands when families didn't know what to say. He mentored young Black cadets preparing for basic training, not just teaching them how to salute or stand at attention, but how to carry themselves when the world tried to shrink them, how to wear their pride without apology. The world teaches you to shout when you're wronged, to rage, to demand. But sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't in shouting, it's in standing, quiet, unmovable. It's in living your worth so loudly that no one can pretend they don't see it. One afternoon, a local reporter caught up with Elijah outside the VA hospital. Not a major network, just a young woman with a camera and two big dreams. She asked him one question, microphone trembling slightly in her hand. "Sergeant Brooks, after everything, how do you stay so calm?" Elijah looked at her, really looked at her, saw the eagerness, the innocence, the hunger to understand something the world hadn't taught her yet. He smiled slow and steady. Then he said, "Because dignity isn't theirs to give, and it sure as hell isn't theirs to take." That was the lesson, not written in law books, not taught in classrooms. The kind of lesson etched into the bones of anyone who's ever had to fight just to be seen as whole. Across the country, Elijah's story lived on, not through official channels, but through the people who needed it most. In high school history classes, teachers played the grainy airport videos not to shock, but to teach. In military academies, instructors spoke of his name not as a symbol of shame, but of endurance. In barbershops and kitchens and quiet living rooms, parents told their children, "This is what strength looks like. Not fists, not shouting. This." A boy in Chicago, hearing the story from his grandfather, walked a little taller in his JROTC uniform. A girl in Atlanta decided not to drop out of ROTC after a rough week. A veteran in Dallas who hadn't worn his medals in 20 years pinned them back on his jacket for a Veterans Day parade. One story, one man refusing to shrink, one unbreakable stand, and the ripples were endless. You never know how far one act of quiet defiance will travel. You never know how many souls it will wake. You just stand and trust the standing to be enough. One evening, long after the noise had faded, Elijah visited a small park tucked behind a church on the south side of town. No cameras, no microphones, just a simple stone monument. Carved into it were only 6 words. "For those who refuse to bow, He stood there for a long time, the setting sun painting gold across his uniform, not saluting, not praying, just remembering, just being, because sometimes that's enough to remind the world to remind yourself. That dignity once claimed as a mountain no storm can move. The world thought it could silence a man with humiliation. What it forgot was this: you cannot silence a story built on truth, built on sacrifice, built on the simple, immovable fact that worth is not negotiated, it's lived. And Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks lived it without compromise. The world loves to celebrate victories they can measure medals, trophies, loud speeches, but the victories that matter most are the ones that leave no ribbon to pin, no headline to catch. They live inside the people who refuse to let the world break them, and sometimes they live forever. Weeks passed, the seasons shifted, spring thawed into summer, and still the story of Elijah Brooks moved quiet, steady like a river carving stone. At first it moved through military circles, old friends, retired officers, enlisted men swapping stories across kitchen tables and barracks. Then it moved into churches, into community centers, into classrooms, where young men and women sat a little straighter hearing his name. Not because he had fought with fists, not because he had demanded vengeance, but because he had taught something America was always struggling to remember. Dignity is not granted, it is claimed, and once claimed, it shines through everything. The lesson wasn't written in textbooks, it wasn't handed out with medals. It lived in the posture of a man who refused to shrink, in the way he stood when the whole system told him to fall. In a small town in Georgia, a young cadet named Marcus pinned a copy of Elijah's photo inside his locker. He had been ready to quit, tired of the jokes, the suspicion, the constant weight of proving himself. But when he saw Elijah standing tall in that grainy airport video, he understood something his instructors couldn't teach. You don't prove your worth by shouting. You prove it by standing when standing is hardest. In Los Angeles, a mother sat her teenage daughter down at the kitchen table. She showed her the footage, showed her the articles, told her quietly but firmly, they will try to make you small. They will question your place, your right, your worth. Don't let them. You stand, baby. You stand like he did. And the girl watching Elijah's silent defiance nodded with a solemnity far beyond her years. The lesson didn't come wrapped in anger. It didn't demand anything in return. It offered something rarer, a roadmap through humiliation without losing yourself. And for every soul who carried invisible scars, for every fighter too tired to shout, it mattered more than any speech ever could. Back in Monroe, the airport tried to rebuild its image. They hung new banners. They issued new diversity training programs. They hired consultants to tell them how to scrub the shame off their walls. But the people who passed through that terminal remembered. The ground itself seemed to remember. Not because Elijah demanded they change, because he showed them what they were and what they could be if they chose better. At the local American Legion post, Elijah sat with a group of young recruits one Saturday afternoon. No cameras, no speeches, just boots scuffing against concrete floors, just hands calloused from real work. One boy, no older than 17, asked the question hanging heavy in the air. How do you do it, Sergeant? How do you not get angry? How do you not let it break you? Elijah looked at him, took a long, measured breath. Then he answered, I don't fight to prove them wrong. I fight to prove myself right. Because if you build your strength on their approval, you'll fall every time they take it away. The boys around him nodded slowly, the lesson sinking deeper than any textbook could reach. That's the lesson the world almost forgot. Your worth isn't up for debate. Your dignity isn't a prize they hand out when you behave. It's yours. It's always been yours. And standing in that truth, even when the world spits at your feet, is the purest form of power there is. Meanwhile, in corners, Elijah would never see his lesson bloomed. A security officer at another airport quietly stepped in when a young black soldier was questioned too harshly. A teacher rewrote her civic syllabus to include stories of everyday heroes who fought battles no one filmed. A lawyer took on a case, pro bono, remembering that dignity deserved a defender even when it wasn't profitable. The ripples kept moving. The mountain kept shifting. Because one man stood still when it mattered, and the world had no choice but to move around him. The lesson wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, it was carved in silence, forged in fire, and it would outlive every headline, every scandal, every fall, because real strength leaves echoes long after the shouting dies. And Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks, he had become an echo that would never fade. Some lessons are whispered in quiet corners. Some are shouted in packed arenas. But the rarest lessons, the ones that carve into bone, are taught in silence by men who refuse to fall. It was late September when Elijah Brooks stood again in front of the school where his story had first been shown to a group of wide-eyed high schoolers. He had been invited quietly, no grand ceremony, no fanfare. Just an email from a history teacher who wrote simply, "They need to see you." Elijah walked the halls lined with faded posters in teenage laughter. He passed lockers dented by years of restless hands, past teachers carrying too much in tired arms, past kids who didn't recognize him yet, somehow stood a little straighter when he passed. In the auditorium, the lights were low. The stage was bare. No microphone, no banners, just a single chair placed in the center, waiting. Sometimes the greatest lessons are taught not by standing above others, but by sitting among them. Not by commanding attention, but by offering yourself bare and unshaken. He sat, folded his hands. Waited one by one, the students filed in. Hoodies slouched over heads, sneakers squeaking across linoleum. Whispers bouncing like rubber balls across the room. But when Elijah lifted his head, when his eyes swept across them, the noise died. No words yet, just presence heavy, real, unignorable. A young girl in the front row raised her hand first. She couldn't have been more than 16. How she asked softly, "Do you not hate them?" The question floated into the silence, fragile and raw. Elijah let it hang there a moment longer. Then his voice low and even. Hate, he said, would give them more power than they ever deserved. The room shifted. Breaths caught. Pens stopped scribbling because it wasn't an answer crafted for applause. It was the kind of truth that lives in scars you don't show. They thought dignity was something they could strip away. They thought humiliation was the final blow. But dignity, real dignity, is a fire. No storm can drown. And Elijah Brooks had carried that fire through every storm they threw at him. Another student, this one taller, broader, asked from the back, "Did you ever think about giving up?" A small smile flickered across Elijah's face. Not bitter, not cynical, just human. Every day, he said simply, every day they try to make you smaller. Every day they hope you'll sit down, shut up, disappear. He paused, eyes locked with the boys. But standing up isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something matters more than fear. And for Elijah Brooks, what mattered most was simple. The next boy, the next girl, the next life watching from the shadows, wondering if it was worth it to stand. For an hour, Elijah answered questions, shared memories, shared scars without ever pointing at them. He didn't preach, he didn't blame. He showed them something far harder, how to carry yourself when the world tries to cut you down, how to walk through fire and come out not untouched but unbroken. When it was time to leave, the students rose without being told. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout, they just stood. A room full of teenagers, awkward and restless, and figuring out their place in a broken world, stood for a man who had shown them that standing was still possible, still necessary, still powerful beyond measure. You teach with words, you teach with deeds, but the lessons that last the longest are the ones you live. Outside, the afternoon sun dipped low against the horizon. Elijah paused by the school's flagpole, watching the flag ripple slow and steady in the breeze. He thought about the boy he had been once. Young, angry, confused about a world that asked for loyalty, but repaid it with suspicion. He thought about the men who had come before him, who had stood taller, fought harder, fallen quietly so men like him could rise. And he thought about the future, the boys and girls now carrying pieces of his story in their own hearts, not because he asked them to, but because he refused to bow when it mattered. The lesson wasn't about him. It was never about him. It was about the ones who would walk after him, about the ones who would face their own storms and remember, someone stood, someone endured, someone proved that dignity is a power no injustice can steal, and that power once passed on never truly dies. Some stories end with applause, some with medals, some with banners waving against the sky. But the greatest stories, the ones that carve themselves into the soul, end with a man walking away, his dignity intact, his silence louder than any anthem. It was a crisp autumn morning when Elijah Brooks pulled a worn hoodie over his broad shoulders. Simple black, no logos, no slogans, just fabric and history stitched together by 1,000 battles no one had bothered to record. He didn't wear it for fashion. He didn't wear it for comfort. He wore it because he could, because every thread whispered a truth they once tried to deny. I belong here, I always have, and I don't need your permission to walk free. The town moved around him as he walked down the main street. Some recognized him, a quiet nod here, a handshake there. Most didn't, just another black man in a hoodie, blending into the early bustle of coffee shops and bus stops, and that Elijah thought with a flicker of a smile was exactly the point. Power isn't always loud. It doesn't always come wrapped in flags or parades. Sometimes it's the simple act of existing boldly in a world that once demanded you shrink. Sometimes it's the sound of footsteps, refusing to rush, refusing to hide. He passed the diner where old men play checkers under the awning, past the hardware store, where the bell above the door jingled at every customer, past the barber shop where someone had taped his story to the window, an old news article yellowing under the sun. Elijah didn't stop to read it. He didn't need to. He carried every word in the way he moved, in the way he lifted his head without apology. At the corner of Main and Fifth, a group of teenagers leaned against the wall, hoodies up, laughter spilling into the morning air. When they spotted Elijah, they straightened slightly, not out of fear, but out of something harder to fake. Respect, the kind that doesn't come from age or authority. The kind that comes from knowing instinctively you're looking at someone who fought battles bigger than fists. Someone who survived without losing himself. One of the boys called out, half teasing, half awed, "Yo, OG." "That you," Elijah chuckled under his breath, tilted his chin in acknowledgement. "Stay solid," he said simply, his voice carrying farther than any lecture ever could. The boys nodded, their laughter softer now, their smiles a little sharper with understanding. The seed was planted, the next generation was listening. Sometimes you teach with speeches, sometimes you teach with marches, and sometimes you teach with nothing more than the way you wear your own skin. Unashamed, unbroken, unapologetic. Elijah crossed into the park at the edge of town, the same one where he'd watched 4th of July parades as a boy dreaming of uniforms and honor. The playground was half empty, mothers sipping coffee on benches, children darting between swings. He spotted an old friend on a bench, Sergeant Lewis, retired, Marine scars peeking from the edges of his sleeves. Lewis looked up, grinned wide. "About damn time you showed your face." Brooks, Elijah smirked, sat down beside him. They didn't need words to fill the space. Brothers in arms understood each other in silences the world would never translate. Lewis tossed a pebble toward a row of pigeons and said casually, "Whole damn town been talking about you." Elijah shrugged under his hoodie. "Let 'em talk." Lewis chuckled low and rough. "Ain't talking bad, son. They talking like maybe they remembered something they forgot for too damn long. He paused, studying Elijah from under his ball cap. You reminded him dignity, don't ask for permission. Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of it settling into his bones, into the earth beneath their feet. He hadn't set out to teach anyone anything. He had just refused to forget who he was, and that somehow had been enough. Some men walk into history with banners blazing. Some are dragged there against their will. But the rarest of all the ones we truly remember are the ones who walk quietly, hood up, head high, carrying the weight of 1,000 silent promises. Promises made, promises kept. The wind stirred the leaves around Elijah's feet. Children's laughter echoed across the park. He rose slowly, pulling the hoodie tighter against the breeze. Lewis gave him a lazy salute, one soldier to another. Elijah returned it with a small, respectful nod. No drama, no speeches, just men who understood that survival, when done right, becomes a legacy, a path others can follow long after your name fades from the headlines. And so Elijah Brooks walked on through the streets that once doubted him, through the eyes that once judged him, through a world still learning how to carry its own weight. He didn't need their applause. He didn't need their permission. He only needed his own 2 feet, his own steady heart, his own quiet fire. And that was enough. It had always been enough. Some roads are paved with applause, some with banners, some with stones. But the road Elijah Brooks walked was different. It was paved with silence, with memory, with every battle fought not for glory, but for the simple right to exist without apology. And still he walked. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Elijah made his way toward the old library, the heavy hoodie draped over him like armor. Inside the building smelled of old paper and stories too stubborn to fade. He paused at the door, remembering how as a boy he would sit in the far corner, hoodie up, pretending to read while dreaming bigger than the town had allowed. How he memorized the stories of kings and warriors who had been erased from textbooks but never from spirit. How he had promised himself, one day I'll be more than they expect. One day I'll walk where they said I couldn't. And he had, not with parades, not with fanfare, but with every silent, stubborn step. Inside the library, the world was quiet. Old men nodded from reading tables. Teenagers whispered over textbooks. At the back near the history section, a small display caught Elijah's eye. A framed article under glass. The stand at Monroe, National One Man's quiet fight for dignity. No giant banner, no lights, just a simple tribute. A reminder. Elijah stood there a long moment, the words blurring slightly at the edges. Not from regret, from gratitude. Because sometimes survival wasn't about noise. It was about planting something deep enough that even time couldn't rip it out. You don't win by shouting your worth. You win by living it, by folding it into every step you take until the world has no choice but to follow. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly back, approached quietly. She smiled, a warm, genuine thing. Thank you, she said simply. Not because of the article, not because of the scandal, because she understood what few truly did. That surviving with your dignity intact in a world determined to strip it away was an act of revolution. Elijah nodded, sliding his hands into the pocket of his hoodie. No speeches, no declarations, just a man walking his truth, one quiet day at a time. Back on the street, he passed a mural painted along a brick wall new since the last time he'd walked this way. It showed a black boy, hoodie up, head held high, walking through a field of storm clouds. Above him, bold letters stretched across the wall. Stand anyway. No signature, no explanation. Just a message left for anyone willing to carry it forward. Elijah paused, smiled, and touched the brim of his hood in silent salute. Every step you take while carrying your dignity plants a seed. You may never see the tree that grows from it. You may never sit in its shade, but someone will, and sometimes that's enough. Near the bus stop, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran cap lifted a hand as Elijah passed. A silent nod between soldiers, separated by generations but bound by something stronger than time. Elijah returned it without words. Some brotherhoods don't need explaining. They're written in the way your back straightens under weight, in the way your eyes say I see you, in the way your steps sound different when you're walking for something bigger than yourself. At a small cafe near the edge of town, Elijah ducked inside for a coffee. Heads turned when he entered, not with fear, not with suspicion, with recognition, with respect. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring and sleeves of tattoos, smiled wide as she slid a cup across the counter. "First one's on the house, Sergeant," she said, voice bright. Elijah accepted it with a simple nod. Because dignity doesn't demand free coffee, it doesn't demand recognition, it doesn't demand anything. It just is. The ones who stand quietly, who walk with steady feet, even when the ground shakes, they build bridges without ever picking up a hammer. They change the world one silent refusal at a time. Outside, Elijah sat on the bench, sipping slowly. The town moved around him. Children laughed. Car engines rumbled. Buses hissed at corners. Life imperfect and stubborn and beautiful flowed on. And Elijah Brooks' hoodie-up heart steady sat in the middle of it. A living reminder that true victory doesn't always look like conquering. Sometimes it looks like surviving without giving an inch of your soul away. They thought they could shame him. They thought they could break him. They thought they could make him forget who he was. But Elijah Brooks remembered, and because he remembered, so would everyone who saw him walk by. The hoodie walks on, the man walks on, and the story lives. Some endings are written in gold, some are written in blood. But the rarest endings, the ones that last, are written in the way a man chooses to walk away, not defeated, not angry, whole. The afternoon light softened as Elijah Brooks rose from the cafe bench, pulling the hood of his black sweatshirt a little higher against the cooling breeze. The streets buzzed with life around him, small lives, big dreams, quiet struggles, too ordinary to make the news. But Elijah saw them, felt them because he had walked their road before, still walked it now. And he knew every silent battle mattered. Every invisible victory counted. He crossed the street toward the old community center, its peeling paint and worn steps, no match for the spirit inside. A mural covered the side of the building. Now a group of figures, some young, some old, some dressed in military uniforms, some in hoodies just like his. Above them, a single phrase stretched wide: "We are not invisible." The ones they tried to ignore, the ones they tried to silence, the ones they pushed into the shadows. They are still here, still standing, still seen, because one man stood when they needed him to, and the ripples of that choice can never be undone. Inside the center, a group of teens gathered voices, loud and messy. In that way only hope allows. Elijah leaned against the doorframe, unseen at first, watching them build their dreams. One stubborn conversation at a time. A girl with bright blue braids argued passionately about starting a youth program for veterans. A boy in an oversized hoodie rapped verses under his breath, working through lines of anger and pride. Another group planned a mural of their own, sketching fists and flames and flags on wrinkled notebook paper. None of them moved like they were apologizing for being here. None of them moved like they expected permission. Elijah smiled, slow and quiet. One of the youth leaders noticed him, grinned wide, and waved him in. He didn't speak, didn't lecture. He just nodded once and sat down among them. Another hoodie in a sea of hoodies. Another warrior among a new generation of fighters. Not for blood, not for medals, but for the right to exist fully, visibly, unapologetically. The greatest power isn't the power to command. It's the power to inspire without ever needing a word. To plant seeds of strength simply by standing your ground. Later, as the evening thickened into dusk, Elijah walked back through the town. Street lights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks. He passed a bus stop where a young mother pulled her daughter onto her lap, whispering stories against the coming dark. He passed a barber sweeping hair off the floor, whistling a tune no radio had played in years. He passed a pair of teenage boys practicing jump shots under a broken streetlight, laughing at every wild miss. All of it ordinary, all of it sacred, all of it worth fighting for. The world isn't changed by grand speeches. It's changed by the quiet decision to live like you deserve to be here, fully, proudly, unbreakably. At the corner of 8th and Vine, Elijah paused. A bus rumbled past its sides, plastered with faded ads. Across the street, a little boy clutched a tattered basketball under one arm, watching Elijah with wide, wondering eyes. The boy wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves swallowing his small hands. Elijah met the boy's gaze, nodded once, and the boy straightened his back, gripped his ball tighter, and nodded back. No words, just the silent handoff of a truth too old for language. You matter, you are seen, stand anyway. And so Elijah Brooks walked on, not for glory, not for applause, but because walking was itself the victory, because surviving with your soul intact is a revolution the world can never take back. The hoodie rippled slightly in the breeze. The boots struck the pavement with slow, steady rhythm. The sky deepened into purple, the first stars stitching themselves into the fabric of night. And somewhere in the distance, not in lights, not in cheers, but in the steady heartbeat of a community learning to stand again, Elijah's story lived on. They tried to bury him, they tried to shame him, they tried to erase him, but Elijah Brooks walked on. The hoodie walked on, and dignity walked with him forever. Sometimes the loudest battles are fought in silence. Sometimes the strongest victories leave no trophies behind. And sometimes all it takes to change the world is one man refusing to bow. Sergeant Major Elijah Brooks didn't shout, he didn't demand, he didn't break. He walked, steady, unshaken, free. And in doing so, he reminded all of us that dignity is not given, it's claimed. And when you carry it with you, no force in the world can take it away. This story isn't just about a man in a hoodie. It's about every single soul who ever stood alone, who ever carried the weight of invisible battles, who ever chose to walk with their head high, even when the world wanted them to fall. If Elijah's story moved you, if it reminded you of the power you carry inside, stand with us. Subscribe to Silent Power Stories for more true stories of dignity, resilience, and the quiet warriors who refuse to be erased. Hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Turn on the bell so you never miss the next silent battle that demands to be heard. And tell us, where are you watching from? Which part of Elijah's walk spoke to you the most? We read every comment. We walk this road together. Until next time, keep standing.